Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second hour of the Sunday session of our, IPHA 2026 conference. I want to introduce Marc-André Cotton, who's going to talk about toxic masculinity in this section. Marc-André is currently the president of the IPHA. I formerly served as vice president. He is an educator and a prolific psychohistorian. And Marc-André, if you want to say anything more about yourself, please do, and then you can start right in.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Brian. Indeed, I've been involved since many years in parenting as a parent myself, but with trying to spread the good word of benevolence parenting and relation to the child, because I think that's where it all starts. Childhood, right? And we all carry, as we know, but sometimes we forget, we all carry something deep inside of us, which is invisible and comes visible through acting out at times. And I'm still moved by the presentation of Suzanne, which we just had. And she really makes the point of the body coming forward with symptoms, with tics, with hysteria, whatever you call it, depending on the period. And so I'm very, I would say, grateful to be able to present today. And I have a PowerPoint that I would like to share, and then I'll go. All right, can you see it? Probably. You tell me if something goes wrong. Right. So
Yes,
the title of this
we
presentation,
see it.
okay, traumatic dissociation and the rise of toxic masculinity in the modern world, a social and neurobiological perspective. So I chose this subject because we had somehow an encounter between something that is apparently exploding, this concept of toxic masculinity, which I will talk about. And in parallel, we have research, neuroscientific research, and openings that connect the dots. And so I will, go on with that perspective and examine what we call toxic masculinity from both a social and neurological perspective. Well, across the world, let's take a picture here. Lethal and sexual violence is overwhelmingly a male phenomenon. We have data on that, and the US is no exception. Men account for more than 80% of arrests for violent crimes and nearly 90% of arrests for homicide. Almost all perpetrators of rape and sexual assault are men, while women and many children bear the brunt of victimization. About 1 in 5 American women has experienced a completed or attempted rape in her lifetime. And according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, about 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys are sexually abused during childhood. So that represents tens of millions of individuals, most of them abused not by strangers, but by someone they know. So we're not dealing with isolated cases. We're facing a structural phenomenon. And although girls are more frequently victimized, boys represent millions of cases, often even more silent. I will argue that male violence cannot be understood without acknowledging male victimization that is often denied, silenced, or dissociated. I will therefore approach trauma from a developmental perspective and consider violence as a dissociating survival response. A dissociating survival response. That will be the important thing in the talk. The work of French psychiatrist and trauma specialist Dr. Miel Salmona provides a powerful framework for understanding this. As we shall see, she describes how extreme violence, especially sexual violence and violence in childhood, leaves behind a state of permanent threat a dissociated neurobiological state that she calls traumatic memory. When this memory is not addressed nor treated, it can fuel both self-destructive behavior and violent acting out toward others. In this talk, I will explore how this model can help us make sense of the global rise of toxic masculinity with a particular focus on male violence in the contemporary US. And I will conclude by emphasizing the importance of informing caregivers and protecting children from all forms of violence. So, my presentation in 2025, thanks to the US translator Kate Rose, one of Salmano's bestsellers was published in English by Routledge under the title Sexual Violence, Dissociation and Inequality, A Guide to Understanding Traumatic Memory. I believe this is an important contribution to understanding violence in general and male violence in particular. We'll begin by defining what we mean by toxic masculinity. At its core, toxic masculinity is embedded in a culture of violence, sustained in part by the suppression of emotional expression. Let me make this more concrete. A boy grows up in an environment where he's exposed to violence or sexual boundary violations, and where expressing fear or distress is discouraged or punished, even punished, right? He learns very early to disconnect from what he feels. But as we know, disconnection is not resolution. What is split off remains active and may later return in the form of impulsive or violent behavior. I will turn to psychotrauma and the concept of traumatic memory, drawing on insight from psychotraumatology, neurobiology, considering both victims and perpetrators. One of Dr. Salmano's major contributions is to show how that violence itself can function in some cases as a dissociating response. At the same time, for violence to be enacted and sustained, it must be supported by a system of beliefs that render it acceptable. Finally, I will emphasize the importance of trauma-informed care. We talked about that yesterday already, in order to interrupt what might otherwise become a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. Toxic masculinity. Many authors have described toxic masculinity as a pattern of emotional suppression and dominance shaped by social norms. For instance, feminist thinker and social critics Bell Hooks describes it as the socialization of boys into patterns of emotional repression and domination, where vulnerability is denied and power over others is valorized. Similarly, Raywin Connell, one of the most influential sociologists in gender studies, understands it as an exaggerated form of hegemonic masculinity characterized by devaluation of vulnerability and femininity. I would like to extend these perspectives by exploring how such patterns may also emerge from unresolved trauma and dissociation. In particular, the lack of empathy, often associated with toxic masculinity, can be understood as a defense response, an attempt to suppress feelings of vulnerability rooted in earlier experience of abuse. This framework can help us make sense of the contemporary rise of toxic masculinity as reflected in current social and political developments. This pattern can be observed in a range of social phenomena in the US today. First, in the persistence of sexual violence and what is often described as rape culture, where coercion is normalized and women's boundaries are minimized or dismissed. It is also visible in forms of misogyny, where anger toward women is expressed through humiliation, control, or devaluation. In its most extreme form, this pattern can be observed in mass shootings, which are committed almost exclusively by men and often involve a history of isolation, humiliation, or perceived rejection. More broadly, toxic masculinity is often normalized as a legitimate way of asserting power or resolving conflict. And this is evident in political discourse and in the recurring use of military force in international affairs. These phenomena may appear different, but they share a common structure: the suppression of vulnerability and the transformation of inner distress into outward domination or violence. Salmona shows that for some individuals, violence can serve as a way to escape traumatic memory, often at the expense of more vulnerable individuals, as evidenced in this slightly edited quote. As perpetrators come to see themselves as entitled to certain privileges, they may use violence to escape traumatic memory, numbing their emotions at the expense of the most vulnerable. To understand how violence can function as an escape from traumatic memory, we need to take a closer look into the neurobiological mechanisms of dissociation. The aim of sexual violence, dissociation, and inequality is not merely to denounce a deeply rooted human tragedy, but to elucidate the psychological and neurobiological mechanisms underlying it, both in victims and perpetrators. The book builds on a tradition of research dating back to Sandro Ferenczi, one of the first to take seriously the reality of violence, particularly sexual violence. This sequence of drawing by Salmona illustrates a normal response to threat. When sensory information signaling danger reaches the thalamus, it is rapidly relayed to the amygdala. So it's little, but it's hard for me to enlarge. So you have the stimulus, the thalamus, the amygdala. This triggers an automatic stress response even before conscious awareness. But what comes next? The body's survival system is then activated, we see here, and releasing stress hormones such as adrenaline, cortisol, to prepare the organism for action. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which is here, begin to analyze the situation, drawing or pass on past experience and contextual information. What's going on really? Is it a piece? Is it a stick of wood, or is it a snake? To take Ledoux's example, for those of you who know. Once the danger is understood, these higher centers regulate the stress response, adjusting it to what is actually required. The situation is then integrated into autobiographical memory and can later be recalled without reactivating the same intense emotional state. And this is the normal response to threat. Now, what happens in a traumatic situation? The amygdala, which is here, is activated as in a normal stress response, but the intensity of the event overwhelms the system and paralyzes higher brain functions, a state known as traumatic shock. The prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus can no longer regulate the response, and stress hormones are released at extreme and uncontrolled levels. We have here the amygdala and the stress hormones that pour into the body. This surge of stress hormones can become toxic, placing the body at risk of serious physiological damage and, in some cases, death, especially with very, very young children or babies. To protect itself from this overload, the brain triggers an emergency shutdown to survive, right? Disconnecting emotional signals and inducing a dissociative state. So that's what happens here. You have the hippocampus, which is disconnected. As a result, the person may feel detached, unreal, or unable to act, while the traumatic experience is not properly integrated into memory. This unprocessed emotional overload remains trapped in the amygdala and forms what Dr. Salmona calls a traumatic memory. So, what she shows is that trauma does not simply disappear. It remains active in the form of a traumatic memory. She describes an acute stress response in the weeks following the trauma. Later, PTSD may develop with symptoms recognized by the American Psychiatric Association. In addition, strong dissociative symptoms may persist, including emotional anesthesia, altered states of consciousness, and a sense of unreality. The phenomenon of traumatic shock explains why victims may be unable to think, analyze danger, or respond to aggression appropriately. And they may be mistakenly perceived as consenting when they are in fact paralyzed. So there is here something to learn about the symptoms of dissociation. Other victims may develop dissociating behaviors, ways of escaping or numbing the experience, which can sometimes take the form of acting out. This is where trauma begins to shape behavior and potentially contribute to the repetition of violence. Dr. Somono writes, one is not born victim, just as one is not born perpetrator. We become these essentially through manipulation, discrimination, and injustice. So, what about violence by gender? If we now place this mechanism in a social context, an important question emerges. How are dissociating coping strategies shaped by gender? Why are men statistically more prone to violent acting out than women? And why toxic masculinity? We have seen that girls are more likely than boys to be victims of sexual abuse. However, there is also strong evidence that boys are more frequently subjected to physical punishment and violent discipline. In the US schools, boys represent around 78% of students subjected to corporal punishment, according to Human Rights Watch. In some districts, they are up to 5 times more likely than girls to receive such punishment. More broadly, research suggests that boys are more likely to experience harsh physical discipline, both in the US and in many other countries. One explanation is that physical punishment of boys is often seen as more socially acceptable or even necessary. Boys are perceived as needing to be toughened, whereas girls are more often viewed as vulnerable and in need of protection. In many cultures, physical violence toward boys tends to be normalized, even while girls remain disproportionately exposed to sexual violence. This difference in early socialization may help explain how dissociating coping strategies later take gendered forms. This photograph dates back to 1964 and was taken in a school in Orange County in California. The smiling faces are striking. While we should be cautious not to over-interpret a single image, they may suggest that violence produces a strong emotional effect not only on victims, but also on those who inflict it or witness it. From Dr. Sulmana's perspective, this is an important point. Violence may function not only as punishment or domination, but also as a dissociating coping mechanism, temporarily relieving internal tensions by disconnecting emotional distress.
You heard
For the
me?
record, For the record, the US remains one of the few countries where corporal punishment in schools is still legal in some states, while even the Lagos state government in Nigeria banned corporal punishment in all schools in 2022. Social misrepresentation of violence. What happens when violence is not only experienced early in life, but continuously reinforced by the surrounding culture, by myths, by political discourse and media representations? What happens when violence is confused with education, when love and sexuality are entangled with domination and the eroticization of hatred and when war itself is justified as a moral struggle between good and evil. In many cases, victims are not recognized as such and quickly learn that suffering does not grant them the right to complain, let alone to be protected or defended. They are often silenced and pushed toward repression. When they do speak out, they may face indifference, disbelief, or denial, even from those who should listen to them, support them, and care for them. Victims are often implicitly expected to move on as if nothing happened. At the same time, perpetrators may benefit from the widespread belief that violence is inevitable or simply part of human nature. We are therefore encouraged to seek safety in supposedly protected spaces, the family, intimate relationships, religious communities, or even the nation itself. Yet, because domestic violence is frequently denied, idealized environment may conceal forms of domination behind closed doors, sometimes disguised as love, discipline, or protection. When acts of violence committed by trusted individuals are unrecognized or ignored, the most vulnerable individuals remain at risk, especially children. The resulting unresolved trauma memories may contribute to ongoing patterns of dissociation, reenactment, and or even an attraction to violent behavior. Here is a slightly edited quote from Dr. Simona's book. At the root of a real addiction to violence are dissociative substances similar to morphine and ketamine released during traumatic disjunctions. This helps explain why violence may be repeated and often escalates in severity. From this perspective, violence is not only aggression, it may also function as a regulatory behavior. And this makes violence even more dangerous. In some situations, something about a potential victim may reactivate the perpetrator's own unresolved traumatic memory, generating intense inner tension, anxiety, or distress. Violence may then serve as an attempt to escape these unbearable emotional states by reenacting in reversed forms situation of domination previously endured. Victims are often chosen because of their vulnerability or lack of protection. In many cases, previous trauma may itself increase vulnerability, making fear, paralysis, or submission easier to induce. When combined with power, domination, and beliefs, legitimizing violence, dissociative behaviors may contribute to the making of perpetrators. Such behaviors can provide temporary relief from unresolved traumatic memories, both from violences suffered and sometimes violence previously committed. At first glance, these behaviors may seem irrational, self-destructive acts, explosions of rage, or seemingly gratuitous violence directed toward others. Yet, from a trauma perspective, violence may also serve as a dissociative function. As we have seen, traumatic shutdown involves the release of morphine, ketamine-like substances, temporarily numbing emotional pain. Violence may therefore provide short-term relief without confronting the original trauma. But this relief comes at a terrible cost. New traumatic memories are created in new victims, contributing to cycles of reenactment and violence. A cultural example may help illustrate this dynamic. In the late 1990s film Fight Club, male protagonists experience profound emotional numbness and dissociation. Violence becomes a way of feeling alive again, of escaping inner emptiness through pain, intensity, and domination. From Salmono's perspective, such acting out may be understood not simply as aggression, but as an attempt to regulate unresolved distress. To illustrate extreme escalation of violence, let's turn to a case geographically close to the US. The long-running drug war in Mexico, whose death toll rivals with that of many contemporary war zones. In the state of Guerrero, one of the regions most affected by cartel violence, killings, disappearances, bodies abandoned on roadsides have become part of everyday reality. A hitman working for a drug cartel describes to the German-French TV channel Arte his gradual escalation to violence. He began with small-scale trafficking before moving into kidnappings, torture, and murder, describing how violence progressively became normalized. Here is what he said about his motives. In this country, there isn't a single cartel that fights without instilling fear. The idea is to see who goes the furthest, who does the most atrocious things. What made the biggest impression on you personally? The journalist asks. Well, the first time you kill someone, that means the first time you cut someone up. That leaves a mark. From then on, you're not afraid of anything. What is striking in here is not only the cruelty, but the apparent emotional transformation. Violence no longer seems to induce fear, it becomes regulating, numbing, and progressively normalized. In this sense, violence functions as a dissociating behavior, creating a need for increasingly intense acts to achieve the same emotional relief. The hitman appears increasingly detached from the sufferings of others as empathy gives way to emotional shutdown and adaptation to violence. With the brutal logic of cartel warfare, extreme violence becomes both a means of survival, to kill, not to be killed, and a way to cope with previous trauma. Following on Salmone's theory, one could hypothesize that repeated exposure to violence, both suffered and inflicted, gradually reinforced dissociation while trapping the individual in cycles of traumatic reenactment and emotional dissociation. If Muriel Salmone's model is correct, violence does not simply reproduce itself by chance, but through unresolved trauma. As she writes in Sexual Violence, Dissociation, and Inequality, as long as violence is blindly thrust on society's most vulnerable with total indifference and lack of punishment for perpetrators, there will always be a reserve of potential future abusers. In this perspective, violence becomes self-perpetuating. Salmona even emphasizes its potentially addictive dimension while insisting that perpetrators remain responsible for their actions. He argues that the severity of violent behavior may reflect the intensity of unresolved trauma, especially when social environments normalize or justify domination. This may happen in families dominated by authoritarian figures, in sect-like groups structured by rigid beliefs, or even in society that legitimize violence through ideology or nationalist rhetorics. In such contexts, victims are often silenced. Their testimony becomes disturbing because it challenges the very systems that justify, minimize, or deny violence. One of the most persistent cultural beliefs is that violence is simply part of human nature. We find this idea, for example, in Freud's notion of an original aggressive drive. Yet, such belief may normalize violence and even reshape language itself. In an Orwellian reversal, violence becomes education. Rape becomes passion. Victims become unreliable, unstable, or pathological. Salmona reminds us that, at least in European legal frameworks, sexual violence is increasingly recognized for what it is, a form of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, sometimes even torture. One of her strongest criticism concerns the lack of awareness of psychotrauma among professionals and within healthcare systems. When psychotrauma remains misunderstood, victims are left unsupported, prevention remains weak, and violence continues to reproduce itself across generations. In this sense, trauma-informed care is not a marginal issue, but a societal responsibility, one that involves protecting children, recognizing victims, and better informing caregivers and professionals. More broadly, Salmona's work highlights the central role of traumatic memory in the reproduction of violence, inequality, and alienation. Perhaps the greatest challenge before us is to stop treating violence as a destiny and begin recognizing its traumatic roots. So thank you for your presence and attention. You can access my Sexual Violence, Dissociation, and Inequality book review at all references by scanning the QR code below. Now, perhaps some broader questions we're left with that I suggest for discussion. What if the violence we fear most is not human nature, but unresolved human suffering? What happens to boys when vulnerability is met with shame or punishment? How do culture and politics shape our acceptance of violence? What would trauma-informed prevention look like? So thanks very much, and I now leave the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Marc-André.